put it away in silver cloth so it doesn't tarnish.
All right. Hey, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started because it's a wee bit late and we've got a lot to do. And we're doing the fun one, the Psalms. Hooray! That's from a 14th century Polish psalter. Just to
Still beautiful.
give you a sense for how people used to do things when all they had to do was that. All right, so the Psalms. There are 150 of them in the majority, well, in the Hebrew Bible and in the majority of Christian Bibles, although there's at least one tradition that has 151st. They're all from different authors. There are multiple genres. We have no idea about who wrote them or when they were written. I mean, this is a collection of 150 independent works. They were probably composed and collected over a period of up to 500 years, depending on the scholar that you're talking to. So this grew over time. Some of them are attributed to very specific people, like David and Solomon. But those superscriptions, and that's what we call kind of, like a Psalm of David. When you read the Psalter and you see that's a superscription. Most likely, those were meant to help the reader have some narrative context in hearing them, as opposed to sort of an accurate historical claim on who the author was. Right, so you get to them and think David. Right, it's like, oh, okay, so think David and move on from there. For today, I have to give credit to Dr. Melody Knowles, who I studied Psalms with over at McCormick and who I TA'd this class with her. So much of what I'll be talking about today comes from her work and lectures and such. Okay, so one of the things we've not really talked about a lot is a specific form of form criticism, if you will, called genre criticism. And that particularly is something that gets used in Psalm scholarship, and one that has been essential for about 150 years, so that number keeps coming up, which is interesting. And that's basically the analysis of the genre of a particular psalm to help us better understand this anthology, really, of songs and prayers as well. So we might ask, as we're getting into the Psalms today, what are the Psalms meant to do, right? These are prayers. They were often sung. We often will see in the notes little notations to sort of help with how worship would happen. So they were used often in worship, but not exclusively. The scholar Walter Brueggemann, who has a wonderful book on the Psalter, if you're ever interested, Psalms and the Life of Faith. And again, next time I'll have a full bibliography for you all of the sources I've used for this. He argues that there are three functions that the Psalms have that correspond to how human beings often find themselves in the world: orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. And what that means is orientation is where everything in your life makes sense, and then something happens and you're disorientated. It feels like you've been sunk into the pit, to use his language. And then there's reorientation, which is that sense of where God has lifted you up out of the pit, and now you're in a new place of awareness and gratitude. And that's something that we see corresponding with many of the Psalms in the Psalter. In terms of the overall structure, it's been put together into 5 different books, and you can see here kind of how that is broken up. Now, when we talk about genre in the Psalms, we have to go to a German Old Testament scholar, and a lot of biblical scholarship sort of is foundational in the work of the Germans. They were very big into it in the 19th and early 20th centuries. One particular gentleman by the name of Hermann Gunkel, about 100 years ago, identified 5 major genres of psalms: hymns of praise, individual psalms of thanksgiving, royal psalms, corporate lament, individual lament, and along with those 5 major, several minor genres. And that just means there are less psalms that he can categorize in that way. Wisdom psalms, entrance liturgies, so something that would have been used kind of like how we use certain things in worship, prophetic exhortation, and psalms of trust. Another German, Klaus Westermann, much later in the second half of the 20th century, was a little bit more flexible in his reading of the Psalms. Time has gone on as people study these, and finds that most of the Psalms can be broadly put into 3 different categories. And this is, if you're going to remember anything about how they're put together, I would remember these 3. Psalms of praise, songs of thanksgiving, and psalms of lament. Most of the Psalms can be more or less put into those 3 kind of over categories. But then, of course, that gets divided, right? So when we think about Psalms that praise, they are Psalms that are often descriptive. They describe God's attributes and God's creative power. They tell us a little bit about who God is. They're also what's known as narrative and declarative, right? Songs of praise talk about what God does, what God has done, what God will do. And then there's lament. In terms of lament, there's communal, the lament of the community or the nation, individual, lament of a person. And then later scholars will add the idea of complaint, right? So the Psalms kind of get a little scandalous here because there's a sense in a lot of them that, okay, God, what is wrong with you? Why are you letting this happen? You need to do something about this, right? It almost feels sort of sacrilegious in some ways, but when you read the Psalter, that's what you get. So this is a rough approximation from one scholar, Michael Coogan, as to how the Psalms these days are roughly categorized. Don't worry, this will be on the test, so I'll show this for a few minutes. Just have this memorized. I'll show this for a couple more seconds. It's fine. But you can see there's a lot of different places through here, and I'm realizing I forgot to highlight the ones that either are sort of... There are several that repeat because they either have multiple genres or scholars aren't really sure where they want to put them, and so there's a few that repeat, and I apologize. I completely forgot to highlight those, but they're in there.
The Torah Psalms,
Mm-hmm.
column 3, bottom.
Yeah.
119
and 119.
119. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Spacing there was...
Oh, yep. Sorry.
No, that's all right.
Trying to fit everything onto one slide was...
No.
I redid that one a few times. I'll just put it that way. That happens. So Coogan starts with Gunkel's 5 major ones and then breaks them further into subcategories. And this is pretty typical of the work that is critical in the Psalter. Although if you Google that right now, you'll find different names of things, different orientations. But this seems to be pretty typical of what kind of the majority of scholarship is at right now. And like some of these categories are pretty contested. For instance, we have right, my Claire, the Royal Psalms right here. My pastor back home wrote his dissertation on the Royal Psalters. And there are other scholars who, and actually he notes this in his dissertation, there are still scholars that argue as to whether or not the Royal Psalms are a thing or not, right? Some argue this is a category, others argue no, it's not a category, we should put them elsewhere. So just to give you a sense for how scholars kind of interact with one another, there's still some of these major and minor category, well, the minor categories, some of them are still kind of in dispute, and I find that fascinating. All right, moving along, we're going to actually take a look at a Psalm of Lament and kind of break it out a little bit. So when you look at a Psalm of Lament, typically they will have these different sorts of things within them. There will be an address, a cry for help, a reminder of God's earlier saving deeds, a lament, a petition of trust, and a vow, or a confession of trust, a petition to God, and then a vow of praise. So let's look at together Psalm 22. We're not going to read it, but just look at how this is broken up, and feel free to can you read the red from there? I wasn't sure if that would. Okay, good. Now this is me just kind of looking at it during the week and trying to do this and remember how to do this. So feel free to disagree with me on this. You are more than welcome to do that. All right, so we start out, my God, why have you left me alone? This is where my God, why have you forsaken me comes from. This is the version that we use in the Pew Bibles. Right, that is an address. You are talking to God. And then, my God, I cry out during the day, but you don't answer. Even at nighttime, I don't stop. Cry for help. You are the Holy One enthroned. You are Israel's praise. I would say that's sort of a continued part of the address. Our ancestors trusted you. This is recalling God's earlier saving deeds. And then, oh wow, those did not come out very well. These are different right here. I'm realizing those two colors look different on my screen apparently than on this one. Apologies. And then this is the cry for help. But I'm just a worm, less than human, insulted by one person, despised by another. All who see me make fun of me. So me in middle school. And then back to earlier saving deeds. But you are the one who pulled me from the womb, placing me safely at my mother's breasts. And then please don't be far away from me because trouble is near and there's no one here to help. Again, cry for help. And then we move into the lament. Many bulls surround me. Mighty bulls from Bashan encircle me. They open their mouths at me like a lion ripping and roaring. And we see there's a lot of lament. And then something changes. But you, Lord, don't be far away. You are my strength. Come quick and help me. This is a confession of trust. Even though these bulls are at him and he's getting made fun of, he still trusts. I'm presuming a him here. There's still this trust that God will come and save him. And then there's the petition, deliver me. Can you read that from where you are? Okay. Deliver me from the sword. Deliver my life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion. That's what you're asking God to do specifically. And then we get into this vow of praise, which takes up quite a bit of this. And it's interesting, I don't know if you notice how it just kind of really turned. It went from like everything's terrible and then you are great. And then at the end, this is what you're saying, okay, God, if you do this for me, this is what I'm going to do. I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. I will praise you in the very center of the congregation. And then sort of inviting and enticing other people to worship God. And that continues all the way into verse 31. So that is more or less what a typical psalm of lament looks like and how it's kind of written out together. Does that make sense? All right. So as we think of the psalm in terms of orientation, disorientation, and orientation, verses 1 through 5 orient us into how much it sucks to be the author right now. Verses 6 through 18 we see are pretty disorienting. We see the author going through this period of disorientation. And then starting at that verse 19, things change and we start to see a reorientation, right? So that is how Brueggemann's 3 kind of work through a specific psalm. Now, pulling back a little bit, as we read the Psalter and we look through some major things, we start to see poetry because these are more or less poems. One of the things we find in this particular type of poem in the Psalter is parallelism. And how this works is essentially a basic exegetical question, right? How does A relate to B, right? Part A of this and part B, and that's something that we see in many cases in the Psalter. But then as we sort of as critical readers of the Psalms keep reading, as close readers, we might ask, okay, so what does A say and B doesn't? And what I mean by that is in Psalm 32 in verse 1, we have two passive verbs in parallel, forgiven and absolved. Now B, absolved, is a little bit more intense than A, forgiven. And that's a pretty typical intensification. You say A and then B you say a little bit stronger. So as readers, we should ask, okay, so are they getting at something different? And then we might ask, who is being addressed here? Who are the people involved? Is this talking about God? Is this talking about a ruler? Is this talking about someone persecuting me? You know, someone bullying me at my locker again? Like, what is this talking about in here? And then those questions kind of can help us to have a deeper understanding and appreciation of what that psalm is trying to get at, right? By looking at the form and the ways in which psalms are often written, we can get a little bit more out of them and have a deeper understanding of perhaps what the author is trying to get at, if that makes sense. Next, we have repetition. And that is basically a fancier word for that is synonymous parallelism. And that's something that we see throughout ancient poetry. That was a convention in ancient poetry in this part of the world. Actually, one way, as an aside that I find fascinating, you may not, one way of knowing if your source is rather old or not is to ask, is to find this sort of parallelism, because it's something that we see in particularly older forms of poetry. And when we come across this as a reader, we might want to ask, how does repetition 1 relate to repetition 2, and what does that mean? And an example of that we find in Psalm 13. The psalmist asks, how long? And asks it 4 different times, right? So as we're looking at that, as an example, I'll pull out my altar psalter. Again, if you missed this last time, this is one of my favorite psalters. It's a poetic translation which tries to keep that voice from the scholar Robert Alter. And he doesn't use how long. I'm looking at the wrong psalm. It's been one of those days, everybody. So, how long, O Lord, will you forget me? Will you forget me always? How long hide your face from me? It's not always the clearest English, but, poetry. How long shall I cast about for counsel? How long will my enemy loom over me? Right? So that's an example of this type of repetition. We might want to ask, how are these related to one another? How are they intensifying? What are they trying to get at? The next one is one that I have a hard time pronouncing. As you've known, I do that sometimes. Anadiplosis, I believe is how it's pronounced. And that is repeating a significant word or a phrase, either kind of, or a clause kind of at the beginning of something, either in the final word of an opening line or something at the beginning of an end of a line. That doesn't make any sense in reading my notes, but an example of that is from Psalm 121 in verses 1 through 2. Where will my help come from? My help comes from the Lord. So it's this repeating a significant idea or a significant word. Something that we see all the time in this type of poetry is metaphor, right? And in some ways, the metaphors that we find throughout the Psalter are structured, and in some ways they're not. The reader needs to ask why these things are together. So the authors will often use metaphor very intentionally, and then it kind of leaves it up to us to figure out what exactly are they talking about and why are they talking about this. So on the one hand, this allows those of us who are reading to kind of work through these metaphors to read the Psalms in ways that actually might surprise the original readers, right? Because we're reading from a different context. We might look at the metaphor of a psalm and come up with a different idea or thought that the original author had no idea about. But then the flip side of that is there might be relationships that the author was trying to get across to their audience that we, in our context, completely miss because we don't know those metaphors anymore. So like both of those things might be true with the psalm, which is sort of interesting as a reader of the psalm. And then in terms of style, we often find a change of perspective. And often that is when things switch from an I to a you. And we will look at that now in Psalm 77. So all of the I and me statements are in red. And then in verse 4, you get to a you in blue. So for the first 6 verses, just take a look at how sort of me-centric it is. And then there's that you just kind of in the middle of there. And that's something that we will often see in this type of poetry, that change of perspective that kind of comes out of the blue. Yeah.
And in fact, there's a change of who the person is speaking to. I cry out to God, so his audience is a general audience until you've kept my eyelids from closing. He's talking there to, I'm assuming God.
I would assume so too, yeah.
He switches from the target of his comments being a general audience to God, right?
Possibly. It's I need to. Let's see.
Otherwise, it'd be I cry out to you, God, and out loud to you, God, so that you can hear me.
Right. Now, I don't know if this is. I don't know off the top of my head what genre of psalm this is. So it's possible it's just a very strange way of doing an individual prayer, or it's possible that it's doing exactly what you said. But that's why paying close attention to the language can help us understand more about that. And then with starting at your question, we can start to delve into, okay, so who is this psalm addressing? What context is this happening within? Like, is this to an audience? Was this used communally? Or is this just a very interesting way of having an individual prayer? And I cannot tell you off the top of my head what that is.
I'm not a poet or a...
That nice little word Selah in there, that there is some kind of shift anyway.
Yeah, that's enough. So as we're reading the Psalms, that's another clue. This little word right here that I made the mistake of when I was an elder and the first time I was reading as a liturgist, I said that word, and then my Psalm scholar pastor kind of pulled me aside afterwards and lovingly chided me and didn't really make fun of me because I didn't know any better, but just kind of reminded me that, oh, you don't say that. What that's a marker of something that happens in worship. And I'll get to that in a second because there's disagreement about what that might mean. Let's put it that way. Okay. So another thing that we see in the style of the poetry in the Psalms often are these acrostics. You'll have 8 verses that will begin with the same letter of the alphabet. So 8 aleph, 8 bets, 8 gimels, because it's Hebrew. So like an example of that going across would be, all this work better be good because it should. And that's just what I came up with when I was studying Psalms for like a really down and dirty. But then it might go down this way too. So you might have like an A, B, C, D, whatever in a line, and then as you're going down, it will also go A, B, C, D. So it's kind of, that's one of those things that if you don't know Hebrew, you'll miss, because it's really hard to make that translation work. But that's something that we find in some of this poetry that I think is sort of fascinating. As we think about the Psalms, these are often prayers, some of them communal, some of them individual. And it's always been used, the Psalter, at least as long as we know, as it's been written down, as a prayer book. And a good example of that are the prayers of lament. Right? These are questions that ancient peoples had of their faith, similar to questions that we might ask, right? So we might ask God about something. Why? Why is this happening? How long is this going to happen? We also find questions and accusations of God. Remember, I mentioned earlier that this gets a little bit subversive. God, you're being unjust. God, you are absent. God, you are silent. The scholar Kathleen Norris notes that this is one of the reasons why, in many cases, if we really think about it, the Psalter can be kind of scary for a lot of people of faith these days, right? Church, we tend to dress up, not only in terms of, in some contexts, how we come to church, but how we think about things, right? And oftentimes we will sort of dress up the problems that we find in the Psalter, and we will use them for singing, or we'll read them in worship, and it's a beautiful church thing. But the problem is when we think we need to dress up either our reading of things or ourselves before we can show our face to God, right? Or we believe that there are certain things that we can't or shouldn't say about God. We kind of put a distance there. How do we have an authentic relationship with someone if we say, oh, well, I can't show up in front of you unless I've done the work first, right? Like, we're sort of presenting a mask to God, right? We're coming before God in a way that we think God wants us to come before God, as opposed to who we are. And what we find in the Psalms is that's not the case at all. I'm mad, I'm sad, this isn't okay, and people are being honest with that. And that's one of the things that's really, I think, really freeing and liberating about the Psalms. They allow us to bring our full selves before God and be honest before God, right? We don't have to pretend that everything's okay so we don't get in trouble or get smited. We don't have to do the proper church thing when we're in our relationship. God wants us to be who we are. And that's something that we see throughout the Psalms. And that doesn't always conform with the culture of particularly Christianity throughout the ages, right? We kind of think about sort of the proper stay sort of thing. And that tension there can cause problems for folks, right? Because we think, well, I can't think that about God. That's blasphemous, right? Or I can't be mad at God. Or God has to always be right. This has to be part of a plan. I can't go down the scary path of thoughts in my head about what's happening. But then we read the Psalms of Lament, and we find that's exactly what the authors of the Psalter are doing. The Psalms don't just permit us, but they invite us to bring our whole selves into the presence of God, right? Not just our sort of, we put on our nice clothes for church selves, but our entire authentic selves. And as we look at ancient Israelite religion, we find that was probably true there. Now, as an aside, minor discursus, doesn't get its own slide. When we think about ancient Israelite religion, there are really two places that probably took place. One of them was at home. Home was a major religious center. And we know this archaeologically. When we find people's homes, we'll often find throughout different periods in the history of the Israelite people, we'll find cultic stuff like incense altars, figurines, occasionally even workshops to make figurines. So, it's not just those of us that like tabletop gaming that are nerds. That goes back a long way. Niches and walls where people would build little home altars. And we see that corresponding in the Psalms because many of the prayers we read are prayers of individuals, right? They're prayers about being sick. They're things that maybe somebody wouldn't necessarily say in a public setting because even back then, you put on a good face before you went to the temple because all your neighbors are there and you don't want to say maybe exactly what's going on in your life. But what we find in the individual Psalms of Lament, they're pretty personal. And then we also have these prayers for a blessing that seem to focus on a more family context. So that is one way in which ancient Israelite religion seems to have functioned, and that we see also throughout in this particular book that was used throughout worship in very different ways. We also have worship at the temple, which we've talked about a lot, right? And there we see these collective prayers of praise that are in the Psalter, as well as collective thanksgivings and laments. And then we also have things like the royal psalms, right? Psalms that were used for very specific occasions in the life of the nation. There are some psalms that would have been used, we think, exclusively during coronations, right? So, dust out the book when King Charles comes through in its time, and then you don't need it for the rest of however long their reign is or whatever, right? There are certain psalms that serve that function, right? So this psalm book really was kind of how the people, or at least part of how the people worshipped, as far as we can tell. And it's important to remember that as Christians in our context, these are our holy texts, but they are also foreign texts that belong to an ancient culture that we are very far removed from. I mean, that's true of the Bible itself, but particularly true of a text like the Psalter, which has been consistently used in people's individual faith life for a very, very long time in very important ways. And then we are reminded that some of these are songs of worship, like the songs that we might sing today. We come from a Calvinistic tradition that at one point we said that we only sing psalms, and there are expressions of Presbyterians even now that will only sing psalms because they believe this is the only way you can authentically worship God, because this is the only worship that we find explicitly in Scripture. And that's where you get to this little word that we saw earlier, Selah, I think. Sometimes it seems to be written at sort of the high point of a psalm, indicating that maybe a musical interlude happens here for emphasis, right? This is where you hit that organ note, or hit that lyre note, or whatever you might be, ring those tambourines. But it's not consistently used like that, which is a problem. So we're not really sure what is happening there. But we also might note, scholars also note that it's very similar to an Akkadian word, selu, which indicates a raising of the hands, right? So maybe this is the part in worship where you do the hands thing. That's entirely possible. Maybe it was used for both. Obviously, the Psalms are used in corporate worship for Jews and Christians today, as they have been for our entire histories. As we think about how they are used in Christian worship, we start with sort of before the church existed, we find in the New Testament stories of Jesus using and quoting the Psalter. We know that early Christian communities from other writings sang some of the Psalms in their worship. The Psalter is considered by some historians to have been central to daily Christian practice in the early times of the church. We know that by the time we get to the 5th century in monastic communities, if you only read and prayed through the Psalter once a week, you were pretty slothful. If you only made it through the entire Psalter in a week, you were a lazy monk in some communities, right? There was a huge emphasis in much of our history for how we use the Psalter. And Christians have always used the Psalms as part of our daily devotions throughout history. One particular use of this, which is fascinating to me, happens in medieval Europe, and it's called the Book of Hours. Have any of you heard of the Books of Hours or Books of Hours? Okay. So these were the best sellers at a time when books were not being printed on a printing press and books were very uncommon. If you had a book, it would have been one of these. It contained usually about 50 psalms, and they were a portion of the psalms associated with what the Catholic Church at the time referred to as the 7 daily prayer offices. They were often glossed and illustrated to help you understand what was happening, and to help those who were less literate or illiterate kind of have a sense for what the psalm was about. In terms of the 7 daily offices, if you don't know that part of our history, around the year 500 CE-ish, St. Benedict's kind of standardized how people lived in community together in monastic communities. And there were rules about praying 7 times a day starting in Psalm 119. And that becomes popular outside of monastic communities, and people, particularly in Europe, start kind of picking up some of those practices. But that's what the daily offices are when I talk about that. The Book of Hours was essentially a primer for what Christians were supposed to be learning, and it was a method of teaching. We know that many young girls learned how to read using these books so that they can pray through the Psalms. And many of the Psalters that we found, including this one, come from rather prominent women. So this is the Book of Hours that was owned by Catherine of Cleves around 1440. But we know that it wasn't just sort of nobility that were reading these. There were sort of regular girls who are learning how to read based off these. So the ways in which this gets used is I think, pretty interesting. And there are some places where you find large portions of the laity reading to the best of their ability large chunks of the Psalter every single day. There's significant evidence that a lot of the ownership of these books was by women. We find that in things like wills. We find it in songs of the day. We even read about it in sermons that are being preached at that time. And by the time of the printing press, these become pretty affordable. Even if in some countries, if you were poor and forced into like a debtor's prison or an almshouse because people are terrible in terms of how we treat poverty, that seems to be pretty consistent in the Western tradition, they would be forced to read the daily office. So even if you went sort of to prison for being poor, this would be sort of forced upon you. Closer to our context, the Psalter will later be used in the education of a lot of people, including enslaved African folk. As we look at the role of women in the Psalms, we learn a lot about we hear the voices of ancient women in the ways we don't in other places in the Psalter. And we also know a lot about the ways in which women use the Psalms. As I mentioned, a lot of women own books of hours, in particular medieval European traditions. And it's been really like one of the places that we know about kind of women and women's faith, and also the ways in which, women weren't all completely illiterate in certain parts of Europe, comes from this work on the Psalms and the ways in which the Psalms were utilized. So, any questions? And then we will get to Proverbs because we still have time.
Is there any consensus on why the order of the Psalms?
No idea. And I don't think there is. If there is, I haven't come across it, other than just being organized into those 5 books. Because let's go back. If you'll notice in terms of how they're organized by genre, like there's a lot of individual laments starting out at first, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But then you throw in an individual song of trust there, and Psalm 1 is a Torah psalm, Psalm 2 is a royal psalm, so they're just kind of all jumbled in there together. So there probably are some, but I have not come across any. And if I have, it's been long enough ago that I've completely forgotten them. That's a very good question.
Very simple question. In their original language, were they, I think of poetry as a rhyme. Did they rhyme in their original language?
No, but they did the things that we kind of talked about, like the acrostics and the repetitions. There's another form of repetition that we see in other forms of scripture that I didn't talk about at all, where you get a lot of, like I'm forgetting the name of this off the top of my head, but you have like A, B, C, C, B, A, that kind of a thing. That's something that we see throughout scripture, but we see that in some of the Psalms as well. So the form of ancient poetry is a little different than kind of what poetry does now. But there was a lot of wordplay, the repetition. Something that we see throughout scripture is they'll have like words that are very, very similar sounding that mean different things that will be put together in certain ways. So we do see those sort of aspects of poetry that we might recognize now, but in terms of rhyming, I don't think that's the case. Anything else?
Was there a rhythm in the original?
Depends. Sometimes, yeah. Like you get that,
Iambic
A, B, C, C, B, A. Sometimes there would be, well, it's not really rhythm in the same way, but these were meant to be sung. So,
Yeah.
To some degree, I think that's probably true. We're kind of stepping outside of my expertise on this.
And what's it called? There's a numeric value for each of the letters. There's a name for that they've gone in some of the Psalms, and there is a certain type of rhythm with it's not numerology, it's in my Old Testament they talked about this a lot, but words have certain values, and there was a repetition of the values of words, even if it wasn't the same word. And right now I'm drawing a blank on what that number thing is, but yeah, there was a repetition in word values and things like that.
I think I knew that at one point, but that's not something I remember being emphasized.
Yeah, I don't remember the term that you're talking about, but there was sort of a mysticism associated with it as well. Almost, what was the Jewish tradition that was rather
Kabbalah?
Kabbalah, I think the numbers associated with certain syllables and
But this
adding
one,
up to a
the
sum.
rabbis and the ones not on the Kabbalah side, but now I'm just thinking, I believe it begins with a G, but anyway.
Well, if there were kind of a rhythm to the Psalms, it would be easier for the populace, at least, to remember. Much as we remember songs now.
I suspect that's more of a feature that we see in the communal psalms as opposed to the individual psalms.
Yeah, okay. The strange woman.
Yeah. Should we get into the
Yeah,
Proverbs for a few
that's-
minutes? Okay. So we are now entering a subsection of the writings known as the wisdom literature. We're in the writings now. We've left the prophets behind. I probably should have said that at the start, but half of you would have missed it anyway. So Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes are called wisdom literature. These are texts that are attributed to Solomon, probably not written by him, that are focused on the human condition as people experience it. One of the things that's kind of a feature throughout all these is we don't really have direct references to Israel's history like we saw throughout most of the prophets. Like the Psalter, Proverbs is an anthology of anthologies, 3 of which are attributed to Solomon, but probably not accurate. There are 2 general categories of proverb. We have insights about human experience that use memorable language, and then we have insights with a religious dimension. It's actually similar to kind of how another text that is in my office that I forgot to bring to show you is written, that scholars point out, the Analects of Confucius. Very different context. Most of the Proverbs with a more religious dimension are pretty focused on this kind of absolute sense of divine justice. There's this very stark dichotomy about how God favors the righteous and punishes the wicked. In terms of the social world of the Proverbs, which kind of helps us understand some things what's happening, there's lots of pithy metaphors and aphorisms that contain insights into human life, right? Probably started out in sort of family and clan lore, like, well, Grandpa used to say this and we say it too, kind of a thing. And some of them kind of start to talk about kind of life in agrarian villages, and I'll stop in just a second for choir. Some of them depict the lives of the elite, royal courts, and urban settings, and they often express, conventional contemporary values and the ideals of living into the law and teachings of the prophets concerning social justice. There's special attention paid in them to vulnerable people. There's this idea that people's rights and vulnerable people's rights are to be respected, even if they're not always considered sympathetically, or even if they're blamed for their own condition, which is sort of interesting. Because usually we see when you blame someone from their condition, you don't sort of respect them, but there's this kind of sense that even if you don't respect how they got there, you still have to give special attention to them. Although there's one category of vulnerable person that we see throughout Scripture that's treated differently, and that is immigrants. We find the idea of immigrants, or sort of the strangers, are sort of treated less well in the Proverbs than they are in other parts of the Hebrew Bible. And some Proverbs are straight up xenophobic and very prejudiced, which is kind of interesting. They certainly express a male-dominated perspective. And that's when you get to the strange woman versus woman wisdom. There are lots of warnings to sort of this, all right, young man, or all right, son, don't have a sexual relationship with a foreign or a strange woman. And that reflects something that we've seen in other places about these concerns about relationships that happen outside of the community. And this reflects a perspective that that's a bad thing. And then there's this idea of woman wisdom. And so, rather, young man, instead of seeking out these women we don't know, seek out woman wisdom. She's defined as the source of order in society, of success in life, and is sort of seen as an accompanier of God. This is a personification of the idea of wisdom that we see in different parts of Scripture. It's possible as a callback to when God was understood to have had a consort. The language is pretty suggested there. Remember, we've talked about Asherah a lot. It's possible this might be a sort of a remembering of that time when God was considered to be married. And then other Christians will later link this idea of wisdom with Jesus as the Word. In Greek, Sophia then becomes masculine in the Gospel of John as Logos. So there's kind of there's some things happening there, and later Christian mystics will sort of pick up that thread and run with it in ways that are interesting. But I'm going to stop us here because it's after time for our choir folk. And thank you all. We're gonna try to get it done next time. We got this.
Gematria.
That's the word.
Yep.
Thank you. Gematria. Yep.
And yeah, this they talk about the Hebrew gematria used in the Talmud and Midrash and all the other things. And even what doesn't sound like poetry to us in some of the verses, it's like that line adds up to a certain number, and that number gets repeated. So to them, or those that are really in tune to gematria, that is a form of poetry for them, because the lines add up to the same. So it's just, I don't know if it was intended or whether that was something that some of these rabbis just came up with to try
It's
to make
possible,
sense.
and that's interesting because I don't think we really talked about that in any of my Hebrew Bible classes. So that's interesting.
Yeah, that was
How different scholars pick up different things and teach different things.
And maybe it was just because it was emphasized in the last 20 years with Madonna, but I thought there was sort of this mysticism of numbers and number of syllables and numbers assigned to particular words and stuff that at least up until relatively recently, the significance of it was lost, and now it's being regained in the Kabbalistic tradition, and almost like making it a little bit of a hocus pocus witchcraft kind of feel to it.
Well, I think that's how it's been appropriated. Because,
Okay.
if stars are good at anything, it's appropriating ancient culture. As I understand it, Kabbalah has been a part of Jewish tradition for a very long time and was really actually picked up and still used by the Hasidic communities. I believe those are the communities of Jewish folks who tend to really focus on Kabbalah, which is interesting because they tend to be sort of the most conservative in a lot of other aspects, but they have this very mystical part of their tradition, which is really interesting.
one thing that they say here that in our culture 7 is like a lucky number. For them it's 18, and that comes from the word kai, which is the 2 letters, and it adds up to 18. So in the Jewish culture, 18 is the lucky number because it's alive. The translation of kai. So.
Yeah, but you don't have 18. Can you get 18 on dice?
Maybe. Well, maybe on a dreidel.
I mean, I have a D20 we could roll an 18 on if we wanted. It's in my bed.
Well, and I was thinking that Kabbalah in ancient days was very much an ascetic, monastic kind of study by the Jewish scholars that were invested in the Kabbalistic thinking or study. It was sort of almost like astronomy. You can't you can't just walk up to a star and dissect it and examine it. You have to sort of have formulas and equations to determine the motion of the planets and the universe is a mathematical equation if only we could figure figure it out. And I thought Kabbalah was sort of in that,
Maybe that's who the whites
Esoteric,
follow the star from
Yeah.
the east.
Yeah, they were court magi from Persia, most likely. So it would have been a different.
And
Still
they were
mystical.
Jewish, I guess, right?
Yeah. What very little I know about Kabbalah is that it's considered very, very advanced stuff. So you weren't allowed to kind of touch it until you'd already kind of.
Just
Yeah. It was pretty advanced spiritual work, if you will. But yeah, Psalter's fascinating. That's my very abridged version because when I studied it, I took a semester to do that. But
I did a little reading on Proverbs because that's what I thought today was instead of Psalms.
yeah, yeah.
And it was interesting that it was talking to this young man apparently about what he should and shouldn't do, and it went to great length about a wealth of topics, but it seemed to boil down to two things. It was how you live individually, and then also by doing that you make your society stronger. So I was getting both lessons. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's interesting how those work, isn't it?
Mhm.
And it's interesting to me that some of these proverbs, we still part of ours, still part of us today. Did I note that down somewhere? No, I've closed all my notes down. Yeah, I didn't start reading it. Anyway. But yeah, some of them are.
It makes
Some pieces of
society
wisdom are
stronger. It unifies behavior.
Yeah.
What's accepted and what's not accepted.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
We will continue that discussion next time as we finish up. Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm glad
And we're
you're
gonna-
feeling better.
Me too. We're gonna try to finish up the wisdom literature and the rest of the writings. We'll see what happens because there's some interesting writings coming up like Job and Ecclesiastes. I mean, they're all interesting,